Welcome to week 6. We are halfway into our semester. This week we are talking about user authentication. This is different to what we have learned last week, which was message authentication. So by end of today's lecture, you should be able to differentiate between what is a message authentication and what is a user authentication, and what is the difference between these two terminologies. Before I start this lecture formally, I want to make two announcements. Your first assignment, which is a report, is due on the coming Monday before 2 p.m. Western Australian time. Do not delay this assignment, because if you submit this assignment after 2 p.m., you might end up getting penalized as per university policies, unless you have got a valid excuse and you have taken an extension. The second announcement I want to make, you must have received this email from me on Monday evening. I am opening a supplementary online test which will start from April 9th. All the instructions are there in that email. This is essentially for those students who couldn't score good in their online test. Please note that if you attempt supplementary online test, you will lose your original marks. So if you have scored good in your actual online test, and if you don't score good in the supplementary one, you will end up getting the marks which you have achieved in the supplementary online test. So you are going to overwrite your marks that you have achieved in the first or the initial online test. The only thing that is different from the original test is that I have increased the time. Now you have got 90 minutes, 1 hour and 30 minutes to answer those 25 questions. Questions might be different, they might be same. I am adding some new questions, but the modules from where the questions are going to come will be the same for module 1, 2, and 3. If you are unsure about anything, send me an email or ask questions during the tutorials or before attempting this supplementary online test. So in today's lecture, when we talk about user authentication, we are talking about 3 aspects: identification, authentication, and authorization. These all concepts allows us in controlling user access to an information system. We will be mainly focusing on authentication, but when we talk about user authentication, these 3 components essentially makes up user authentication. Just to give you a fair bit of understanding, we start this lecture with an example. So what is an identification? Your username is an identification. The user ID that you take when you log into your Blackboard or ECU's website is your identification name, or the username is your identification code, I would say. Authentication, when you enter that password, that falls under the definition of authentication. And once you are successfully logged into the system, to the Blackboard website or to the ECU's web portal, the kind of resources that you can access comes under the definition of authorization. Based on your user ID and the password, the operating system or the network or the system in which you are trying to attempt to log into decides which resources you can access and which resources you cannot access. This is what is meant by authorization, which is also known as the user privileges. So how can we formally define an identification? Identification is a means by which a user provides a claimed identity to the system. Your username is your claimed identity that you tell to the system in which you are trying to log into. What is authentication? Means of establishing the validity of the claim. If you are saying that this user ID belongs to you, you need to prove that claim, and you can prove that claim by entering that password, and that proves your authentication. As I have mentioned earlier, this user authentication is different to message authentication, which we studied last week. In message authentication, the 2 parties ensures that the message that has been sent from party A to party B and the recipient receives that actual message which is not altered, and he is able to ensure that this has been received from the authentic entity. This comes under the definition of message authentication. So, ensuring that the contents of the message have not been altered and the message has been received from the entity who is from the actual entity who is claiming that I have sent this message. These two aspects give you the confidence that this is message authentication or your message has been authenticated. Whereas user authentication is different to message authentication, in which you are telling a system that whatever username that you have entered in the system, you own that user ID. Authorization is the resources or the device or the resources that you can access in that system in which you have been allowed to enter. There are systems in which you do not have to prove your identity. They just take your authentication and allows you to use those resources. And as a real life example, we all use Transport, or to that effect, all the online students who do not live in WA, they must be using some kind of bus service or train service, and they must be using some cards, or they must be purchasing some tickets. So when you take that card or you take that ticket and hop onto a bus or onto a train, you do not have to prove your identity. You just show that ticket or that card, and that allows you, that authenticate you, and that allows you to use that service. Authorization can be given another name as privileges, and we can define privileges and authorization as the ability to do something within a specific system. So you might have seen this message on your uni computers or some other computer, like this task requires administrator privileges, and if you are not logged in as an administrator, you cannot install the software. So there comes your authorization and privileges. So your user ID decides that whether you're allowed to perform a specific task on that system on which you are logged into. Another common example for the fingerprints, for the authentication, is fingerprints. Police normally uses this mechanism as to authenticate a person. So if someone has committed some crime, when the police goes there and they capture the fingerprints from there, and based on that fingerprints, if they have got the information in their database, they can prove that this was the person who actually committed this crime. When we talk about identification and authentication, why we are concerned about these two terminologies and what is the importance of these two terminologies or these two concepts. Identification and authentication is crucial if you want to, or a system wants to, enforce different privileges to allow limit access to resources. The example I've already given you is when you logged into your Blackboard or ECU's web portal. You logged in as a student, I logged in as a staff member, so I have got a different access rights as compared to yours. So there comes a system and decides what privileges a user has on that particular system. It also allows a system to do accountability against that user ID. And once that system starts maintaining all the actions that you are performing on that system, that also achieves the purpose of non-repudiation, which is one of the 5 aims of computer security. Since we are focusing more on authentication methods, there are 4 means of authenticating a user ID. One is known as something the individual knows, which is a password or a PIN number. Something the individual possesses, commonly known as token, like your electronic cards, your ATM cards. Something the individual is, and it has got 2 different categories. One is static, one is dynamic, and we are talking about static biometrics and dynamic biometrics. Like I have been telling you since day one that in computer security, it depends on the textbook or the resource that you are referring to. Some people claim that there are 3 aims of security. The other people think that there should be 5 aims of security. Same is the case here. This picture has been taken from the textbook that we normally refer to in this semester from William Sterling. So William Sterling claims that there are 4 means of authenticating a user. If you look into some other resource or book, you might end up getting that there are 3 main means of authenticating a user. So what they essentially do, they consider the last 2 values as one. Something the individual is, so they take static and dynamic biometrics as one entity. So it depends. If you say that there are 3 means of authenticating a user, and you specify that the third means includes static and dynamic both, then you're right. And if you can also write the 3 means of authentication in these 4 ways, in which you're differently writing or communicating that static biometric is different to dynamic biometrics. So we are going to discuss each one of these methods one by one in today's lecture. Why these authentication methods are important? Because when these authentication methods are properly implemented, they provide secure user authentication, which is essentially we all want to. But there is just a problem. If the implementation is not correct, is not good, then no matter if you have implemented one authentication means or you have implemented all of the 4 authentication means, your system is still vulnerable, and the adversary or the attacker can take advantage of those weaknesses. Some of the common problems with the authentication or the poor implementation of these authentication means is guessing or stealing passwords, forge or steal a token. User may forget a password or lose a token, and that can be taken by an attacker or a threat entity, and that entity can leverage that token or that password and enter into your system or access the system, which by pertaining that he's the one, he identified you as the actual person, and start using the resources or the facilities that that particular system provides you. And the other example I can give you is the false alarms when biometric authenticators are used. We'll discuss more on this particular aspect when we will discuss about biometric authenticators. This is a common terminology nowadays, and the common means of or the most widely and recommended means of authentication in majority of the systems, I would say, and that term is known as multi-factor authentication. And we can define multi-factor authentication as when we use more than one authentication means. If we use something you have, something you know, making it a 2-factor authentication, that is an example of multi-factor authentication. If you use all of the 4 means or 3 means of authentication, that falls under the definition of multi-factor authentication. Obviously, 2-factor authentication or 2FA is important, is more stronger than single-factor or 1-factor authentication, and 3-factor authentication is more stronger than 2-factor authentication. However, we cannot blindly implement these 2-factor, 3-factor, or to that effect 4-factor or 5-factor authentication mechanism, because we need to consider the overheads that are involved or that are associated with 2-factor, 3-factor, and other multi-factor authentication means. And the common overheads are user acceptance. User is not willing to accept those additional security steps. The cost that is involved, especially when we talk about biometrics, and the convenience that we give to the user. So let's talk about something you know. And in something you know, we will specifically focus on password-based authentication, a system in which we use a password to authenticate ourselves with a password-based authentication system. It's a widely used line of defense against the intruders. User provides a username and a login ID, username, login ID, and password. And system compares that password with the one that is stored in the database, or the system password file, or the shadow file. And if that password is correct, you get authenticated, and you will get access to that system. Something you know, or password-based authentication provides you security in following ways. It determines that the user is authorized to gain access to the system. It also determines the user privileges, what you are allowed to do and what you are not allowed to do. And it is also used in the discretionary access control. You can, if we specifically talk about Unix operating system and Windows operating system also, another user can grant you a read access to the file, and when you access into a system using your credentials, you may be allowed to read a file which is owned by some other user. So it also helps us in maintaining the discretionary access control. Password-based authentication mechanism makes use of very common means such as cryptographic techniques. We have been reading this and understanding this concept in the last 2 weeks. It relies on a person knowing something that others do not. This is the single factor that we rely on this means of authentication, because if a person is not able to save his password in a secure way, if he writes his password somewhere that can be read by an attacker, or if as a result of social engineering attack, that user who actually owns that password may share his or her password to that entity who has actually launched that social engineering attack on that person. The common issues that we have with password-based authentication is someone could tell others their password. A password could be guessed, stolen, or cracked. Password policies typically annoy users, and because of that fact, users are not willing to follow those password policies, and they tend to write their difficult password on piece of papers. And user systems that do not have the password policies or stronger password policies, they tend to opt for weaker passwords. This slide shows you what is a weaker password and what is a stronger password, and it gives you different criteria: blank password, default passwords, guessable passwords. As you move along from this point to the towards the stronger protection, if you implement this kind of password in a system, you are much more secure from an attacker than having a blank password or default password, or if you enter a guessable password. Passwords have got some vulnerabilities associated to them. Some of the common password vulnerabilities are listed or shown on this slide, and we will be discussing briefly on each one of these vulnerabilities. First one is offline dictionary attack. It's an attack in which attacker obtains a system password file and compares the hashes against the hashes of the commonly used password. So an attacker somehow obtains a SAM file, which is the Windows file that saves the password, or a shadow file from the Linux operating system or Unix operating system. Once that entity has got that shadow file or the SAM file, we can generally name that file as system password file. That attack entity starts generating some attacks, brute force attack or dictionary attack against that file, and he tries to find that the password against the user ID. The other password attack strategy is a specific account attack, in which the attacker targets a specific account and submits password guesses until the correct password is discovered. So an attacker takes that user ID and then launches a password guessing attack against that user ID. So that kind of attack is known as specific account attack. The next strategy in password attack is popular password attack, in which a user uses a threat entity uses a popular password and then try it against a wide range of user IDs. In specific account attack, you are launching this attack against a specific user ID. In popular password attack, you take a list of popular passwords and then you try those passwords against a wide range of user IDs. And it essentially exploits the user's tendency of choosing a password that is easy to guess. The other password attack strategy is password guessing against a single user. In this kind of strategy, the attacker attempts to gain knowledge about the account holder and system password policies, and then uses that knowledge to guess the password. So it starts with the information gathering or intelligence gathering operation, where the attack entity tries to get as much information as possible about that user and the system to which that user belongs to. So as soon as the attack entity gets that information, the attack entity has got sufficient information, he then tries to use that information to launch an attack. And that kind of attack is known as password guessing against a single user. The other password guessing strategy is workstation hijacking. We have been discussing this when we were discussing about attack trees in Module 2. This kind of attack, the attacker waits until a logged in workstation is unattended. So as soon as you leave your workstation without locking it, and you go to take some printouts or to that effect to do some other stuff, and if your system is not locked, an attack entity can come and start getting some information, some important data from your workstation. Another password attacking strategy is exploiting the user mistakes. If the system assigns a password, then the user is more likely to write it down because it is difficult to remember. So there are systems in place which do not allow a user to choose his or her own password, and it gives the password by generating at its own, and that password is based on different a pseudo-random number. It is a combination of alphanumeric number and special characters. So that password is very difficult to remember. So what a normal user would do in this kind of situation, since that user cannot remember that password, there is a strong likelihood that that user will write that password on a piece of paper, and that allows an adversary to read that written password. And also, one of the other common mistakes that we do, we share our passwords with our friends, and that can also be exploited by an attack entity. An attacker can launch social engineering tactics against a user and successfully obtain a password. And one of the common examples that we have been discussing throughout this semester is using the pre-configured or default passwords and not changing them. And the common example we have discussed is your ADSL modems or your NBN routers, in which we use those devices without changing the default credentials. So essentially, if we do not change those pre-configured passwords or default passwords, an attacker entity would be able to access into that ADSL router or NBN router, NBN modem, and that can invite all sorts of problem for you. Exploiting multiple password use is another password attacking strategy. Essentially what we do is we tend to use a common password for all kind of activities that we perform in the online world. So if you choose the same password for your online banking, and if you choose the same password for some other online service, and that online service does not have a good security mechanism, so if your password is compromised because of that poor security implementation of that online system that you are using, so once that password is compromised, the attacker entity would use or can use that password to steal money from your online banking account. So this is essentially exploiting multiple password use as different network devices or services share the same or a similar password for a given user. So if one password is compromised because of poor security implementation, all of your other passwords will be compromised. Other devices, other information, other data will be compromised. Electronic monitoring, which is which is the last password attacking strategy in today's lecture. It is if you exchange your password using a poor communication channel which does not employ any security mechanism, and if an attacker entity is able to tap that traffic, read that traffic, those packets, then the attacker entity can steal your password. The example I can give you here is if you use a service which does not use SSL or secure socket layers or TLS transport layer security, that golden lock on your browser, if it is using only HTTP, and if you use Wireshark, which is a packet sniffing tool, and if you tap all the traffic, all your credentials will be visible in plain text. So if you are entering a password on a site which is not HTTPS enabled, that is an example of electronic monitoring password attacking strategy. One of the concept in which students and people who are working in the industry often are unable to differentiate is the difference between online password attack and an offline password attack. So an online password attack is an attempt to log into services and find valid credentials. You're actually attacking a system, a live system. It uses techniques known as brute forcing techniques, in which we try every possible combination, every possible username and password, and given enough time, the attacker entity will be able to find the valid credentials. An offline password attack is defined as when we obtain a copy of the password hashes and attempt to reverse them back to plain text password. So we are not actually launching an attack on a live system. If you want to attack this system, you will first try to take the password file from this system, and you will copy that file onto your system, and then you will start employing different kinds of dictionary and brute forcing attacks, and this kind of attack is known as an offline password attack. We also need to understand the difference between dictionary and brute forcing attack. The commonality between these two types of attack is dictionary and brute forcing attack are both guessing attacks. We are guessing the passwords. Dictionary and brute forcing attack can be offline as well as offline attacks. But the difference between brute forcing and dictionary is, in brute forcing we try every possible combination, whereas in dictionary attack we use pre-compiled list of options. So we have got pre-compiled list of usernames, we have got pre-compiled list of passwords or hash values, and we compare those values with the system that or the password file that we want to compromise. These two flowcharts will explain you further about the difference between dictionary and brute forcing attack. In dictionary attack, we take a word from a dictionary, we hash word using one-way function. We compare that hash value with the previously obtained hash, like sheriff file or SAM file. If the hash is matched, we are able to compromise that system. If the hash does not match, we take another word from the dictionary and we perform this step. And we keep on performing this step till the time we have got words in our dictionary. So here we are depending on dictionary. The longer the dictionary we have got, the more options we have, the more times we will run this loop, and the more chances we have to find the successful password. Whereas if we talk about the brute force attacks, we initialize the test string, like we take value A, we take the hash value of value A using a one-way function. What is the example of one-way function? Can you tell me? MD5 SHA-1 256 SHA-512. We test that hash value against the previously obtained password hash file. If the hash matches, we are successful. If the hash does not match, we'll increment the test string. We will add AA, AB, AC, AD, and then we will add some some numbers, and then we will add some special characters, and we'll try to find a password which matches the password which is in the hash file that we have obtained from the user computer. This takes a lot of time. Given enough time and high processing power, you will be able to find a successful password using brute forcing technique, but dictionary attack is limited to the amount of information or the amount of database that you have got. The larger the database, the more chances you have got to find a password. The smaller the database, the smaller your dictionary is, the less chances you have to find a successful password. Then we have got another concept which is known as rainbow tables. Rainbow table is an offline only attack. It cannot be performed online, and it is a huge list of password hashes. The size varies, goes into gigabytes. The two common examples I can give you for rainbow tables is RockU and Darkcode. These are the two famous rainbow tables, but there are many other available online for you to download freely and use them to increase your learning and to launch an attack against against a target. So what are rainbow tables? When we want to crack a large number of passwords, it is inefficient to create a collection of hashes for every target, because hashing also takes time. So rainbow tables are large database of pre-computed password hashes. It already has got password hashes of most commonly used passwords. So instead of computing the hash for every password, you search the database for the desired hash value. So you take the hash value from the system file that you have obtained from the user. You take that hash value and you compare that hash value with the hash value that is available in the rainbow table. Whereas in the previous category, in the dictionary, in the brute forcing attack, the flowcharts we discussed in the previous slide, what we were doing, we were taking the plain text, we were generating the hash value, and we were matching that hash value with the hash value that we have obtained from the user's system. But in this case, we are not generating those hash values. We are taking the hash value from the system that we have, from the file that we obtained from the user's system, and we are taking the hash value that is available in the rainbow table, and we are comparing these two values. So we are taking the help of pre-computed hash values, and that's why we call them rainbow tables, which are the collection of large database of pre-computed password hashes. The side effect of using rainbow tables is that it requires a significant storage space. This is somewhat an example of a rainbow table, how it looks like. You have got a plain text password, and this is the corresponding MD5 value and the SHA-1 value. So essentially, this is how your rainbow table looks like. So what we are obtaining out of these rainbow tables, we are actually reducing our time that we spent in calculating the hash values, because the larger your string gets, the more time it is going to take for the hash value to generate. Yes. Why it is called? Rainbow tables. It was first when the first such kind was launched in somewhere in 2000. I don't exactly remember the year when it was first launched. The person who actually launched this gave it the name of rainbow tables, and from there on, everyone started using the word rainbow tables. So we all know that the system that we are using, we are not actually saving the plain text password in the database. We are saving the hash value of that plain text password. How this hash function works when we want to store passwords, we perform the initial registration where a user enters a password. System generates the hash value of that plain text or the value that is entered by the user, and that hash value is stored in the system password file. When the user tries to log into a system, user enters the same plain text password value, and then a system generates that the hash value using the same hash function and compares that hash value with the value that is stored in the database or the password file. And the diagram shows you the example. You take a password plumless, you use the SHA-1 hashing function, and that value is generated by SHA-1 function looks like this. For the subsequent login attempt, user enters again that plumless password, and you use the same hashing function, and if the value matches with the value that is stored in the password database or the password file, the user is allowed to get into the system and start using the system resources. If we use a poor hashing algorithm, and if we do not implement iterations, we will end up having some password hash collisions. What will happen if we have a collision? If we use a password plumless, and if we use MD5 value, it will generate this. And if we use the password buckaroo, if we use the same password, and if the value is generated by this algorithm is this, then a different user will be allowed to access the same kind of resources that a user with this password was allowed to. So to secure the problems that are associated with password hash functions, we introduce a concept which is known as password salt. What is a salt? A salt is a pseudo-random or random non-secret or unique fixed length value which is combined with the password before it is hashed. So we take the password, we take this pseudo-random unique fixed length value, and we concatenate these two values, and then we input the larger text into the hash function, and that will generate a hash value which we will store in the system database. Password and salt serve as inputs to hashing algorithm to produce a fixed length hash code. The hashed password is then stored together with a plain text copy of the salt in the password file for the corresponding user IDs. So systems that implement password salts, what they have got in their database, in their system password file, they have the salt value in plain text, and they've got the hash value of the salt and the plain text password. So we append a salt with a password. So in this example, the password is test, and this is the salt value generated by the system. This is a pseudo-random unique fixed length unique value, and we concatenate these two values, and then we implement MD5 or any of the hashing algorithm or hash function, and we generate a value. And in our system password file, we will save this hash value and the plain text value of this salt. So we will save these characters in plain text, and we will save this hash value in our password file. So what if the attacker knows the salt? They will still need to calculate a longer list of hash value, requiring additional time and resources before the correct value is found. So it actually delays the objective of the attacker entity in finding the attack entity in finding the password. So what are the subsequent actions once you implement this? The subsequent action is a user provides an ID and a password. A system retrieves the plain text salt associated with the ID. Salt and user supplied password are used as input to hashing function or hashing routine. If the result is matched with the stored hash value, the password is accepted and the user is allowed to use the system resources. What are the benefits of using password salt? It prevents duplicate passwords from being visible in the password file. It greatly increases the difficulty of offline dictionary attacks, and it requires considerable time to crack because we are increasing the length of the hash value. People will try to attempt this approach, and if your password is, I would say, if you have used the password test, which is a very weak password, and as attacker entity is able to find the salt value, it will be very easy for the attack entity to get access to that system or to find that fast password or to break that password.
Yes. So you put in the local one.
Yes.
It takes more time.
Yes.
What is the percentage of criminals that will just give up? I don't have time for this source.
If you recall, in one of the earlier lectures, we discussed that we need some information for the time that information is important, you know. So an attacker entity needs to have enough time. There is no specific time. It depends on the target that the attacker has chosen. If the target entity is very important, and if you want to use, if you know that getting access to this user ID's credentials will give us some sensitive information which we may not be able to access through some other resources, or through some other means, then an attacker entity will wait for whatever time he or she wants to. But it depends on the resources. You know, if you recall, I don't remember, it was probably in Module 2 or Module 3 when we discussed about the concept of state-sponsored espionage activities or information warfare concept, or we talked about advanced persistent threats which are formally supported by the government organizations. So if a government is launching an attack on another government, obviously the amount of resources that they are going to put in to crack those credentials would be much more, and the probability or the chances of getting access to those credentials when a government entity is involved or a criminal entity, well-established criminal entity is involved, or a terrorist or a well-established terrorist group is involved, then the chances of getting that password is much more than if an individual entity tries to access to your system, you know, because he will or she will have limited resources. But it depends on the target, and it depends on the attacker entity, who that attack entity is. So there's no direct answer to this question. It depends on the attack entity, you know, the kind of resources that the attack entity has. So the second concept is something you have. We have spent longer time on the previous authentication means, because the only reason behind that is because we still use passwords or PIN numbers as the main means of authentication. The other two or the other three are not mainly used or not heavily used, but they are being used. I would not say that they are not entirely being used. They are being used, but the reason we have spent more time on the passwords is that we are more used to using that kind of authentication mechanism. So how can we define something you have or something you possess? Is the objects that a user possesses for the purpose of user authentication are called tokens. So essentially, when we talk about something you have, we are talking about tokens. The common examples of tokens is a car key. a general example, smart cards, security tokens, and your wearable devices. Your ATM card is an example of something you have. Okay, so something you have, we're talking about physical devices, a physical item that only the rightful owner should be in possession of. The physical item must be kept safe and secure and not susceptible to duplication. So the kind of ATM cards that we have got now are equipped with the smart card chip or the smart chip. But if we have used earlier debit cards or the ATM cards, they were without that smart chip, and it was very easy for the attack entity to duplicate or to generate the duplicate versions of those cards. A physical item operates on two schools of thoughts. First thought is that only the rightful owner should be able to acquire the authentication device in the first place. So if you have to get your university ID, you have to physically go to the eSmart Lab, Building 34, and you have to physically present there to get your card. So that is this is what we mean by the first point, that only the rightful owner, you are the rightful owner, should be able to acquire that authentication device or card in the first place. No one else should be able to get that card on your behalf. And the second school of thought is only the rightful owners understands how to invoke the authentication component of that item. When you receive your new ATM card or debit card, you need to perform certain steps to enable that card, and those subsequent steps allows you to configure a PIN number or some security challenge questions associated with that debit card or the ATM card that you receive. So this is what we mean by the second point. The common or the earlier means that we used to have in something you have category were the memory cards. So what are memory cards? Memory cards store data, but they do not process data. Example, a bank card with a magnetic strip. I'm talking about the older bank cards, not the recent or the one that we use nowadays. The older bank cards used to have a magnetic strip on the back, and that strip used to store simple security code which can be read by an inexpensive card reader. So those strips, those cards were susceptible to skimming, modification, duplication, and wear and tear. We also are using memory cards when we check into our hotels. We get those physical cards, and those physical cards allows us to use the swipe function to enter into the rooms that are allocated to us. We also use cards in ATMs where memory card is used with a personal identification number, which provides more than a password alone, which gives you more security. So this is the example of two-factor authentication. When you go to use an ATM to draw some money, the first authentication mean is to use your card. You take your card and you enter that card into that ATM machine. That is your first factor of authentication. What is your second factor of authentication there? Entering that PIN number. So combination of these two authentication means allows you to take out money out of the ATM machine. If you do not have a card and you only know the PIN number, it becomes impossible. And if you have got the card and you do not remember your PIN, it is also not possible for you to take out the money from the ATM machine. So in order for an attacker entity to gain access or to use a system using your authentication means, the attacker entity needs to be in the physical possession of the card, and the attacker entity needs to know the PIN number. So with this kind of multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication, we have actually created somewhat problems for the attacker entity to launch an attack against us. Memory cards have been replaced with smart cards. A smart card is a plastic card with an integrated circuit we all are, the ATM card that we have got nowadays are equipped with this smart card, this chip or the smart chip. It has got a microprocessor that includes memory and I/O ports. It has got a ROM and a RAM as well, and it also supports crypto functions as well. It is much more secure than the memory cards, but the vulnerabilities do exist. If the implementation mechanism is not good, if the crypto involved or configured in the smart chip is not good, is weak, then that is vulnerable to different attacks. The circuit that is there on the smart card permits secure transaction to take place between cards and the host devices. There are 3 types of memories, ROM, EEPROM, and RAM, and their function is written against each one of them. And then there's another concept which has started to come, which government organizations have started to implement, and that concept is known as electronic identity cards or EID cards. EID card is a smart card that has been verified by the national government as valid and authentic. And the main idea behind introducing this EID concept is one card, multiple purposes. At this stage, you carry your ATM cards, you carry your driver license card, and you carry all sorts of other cards, Centrelink card, or all kind of different cards. The idea behind EID is to use one card, and that one card is secure with strong authentication mechanisms, and that one card is used for multiple purposes. Germany is one of the countries that I know that has implemented the concept of EID. If we talk about EID implementation at the national level, but there are many sensitive organizations around the world that uses this concept of EID. They use one card to get into an organization. They use the same card to log into their computers. They use the same card to perform other transactions. So this concept has already been implemented, tested, but the main idea behind electronic ID is when the government verifies that EID card, and because of that verification, the entity in which we are trying to log into believes that the system that we are using is, the card that we are using is valid and authentic. Wearable devices have also been used, or they have started to come into effect in the as form of the authentication means. The example that you are looking at on the slide is Bankfast Hello Rings. So this ring is used to perform the, when you visit a till and you want to pay some money, you can use this Hello Ring to pay that money instead of using your card or tapping your card. It's a new form of technology, simple and effective, and this is just the one example that I have given you. And since it's a new concept, this concept can be implemented in different scenarios and different fields. So now we come on to our third and fourth means of authentication, which is something you are, and we can define, we can essentially also use the name of biometric authentication if we are not comfortable using something you are, if you find it difficult to remember. If you mention that biometric authentication is another form of authentication, then it will also be correct. So what is a biometric authentication? A biometric authentication system attempts to authenticate an individual based on his or her unique physical characteristics. And what are those physical unique characteristics? Your fingerprints, your hand geometry, your facial characteristics, your retina, and your iris patterns. These are just a few examples. What is a biometric? A biometric is the application of statistical analysis to biological data, biometric categories. So what is a biological data? Our fingerprints are our biological data, our handprints, our face, our DNA, our iris, our retina. These all are our biological data. So we take that biological data and we perform some statistical analysis on that biological data, and we save those analyses into our database, and then when we save that information into our database, we further use that information as authentication mechanism. There are two categories of biometrics. One is static and the other one is dynamic. Static measures the inherent physical characteristics, whereas dynamic measures the human behavior in achieving or performing a task. So to better understand these two categories, these are the example of static and dynamic. Your iris, retina, fingerprints, hand geometry, face recognition are all the static or physiological examples of biometrics, and the dynamic is your keystroke analysis. The way you type on your keyboard is keystroke analysis. Your signature analysis, the way you sign, is your signature analysis. Your voice, the way you speak, is your voice analysis. Gait analysis we'll discuss later, the way you move, and then we have got cognitive analysis as well. So let's talk about facial characteristics. Facial characteristics are the most common means of human-to-human identification. It considers key facial features such as your eyes, eyebrows, nose, lips, chin, and your chin shape. So it considers all these facial attributes and performs some statistical analysis and then save that binary values into a system that is subsequently used for authentication. Fingerprints is another example of static biometric mechanism. It is a very conventional method. It has been available for years. It is used by the law enforcement agencies primarily, and it is quite accurate. But the problem with fingerprints is they can be replicated. Next is your hand geometry, your entire hand. It identifies features of the hand, including shape and length and width of your fingers. Then is your retinal pattern, which is another example of static or physiological biometrics. In retina, a pattern is formed by the veins beneath the retinal surface, which is unique and suitable for identification. System obtains a digital image of your retina and those vein patterns by projecting a low-intensity beam of visual or infrared light into the eye. So once that beam is given to your eye, those veins that are beneath the retinal surface, they are your biological data. They are taken from that low-intensity beam, and then some statistical analysis are performed on the veins that you have captured, and then that information is saved into the system. Keystroke analysis is an example of dynamic or behavioral biometrics. It is essentially how the individual types at keyboards in different ways. It is not accurate as compared to other biometric techniques. This is the problem that restricts or inhibits its implementation. This is something very interesting, gait analysis. We perform a statistical analysis of human locomotion, the way human moves, based on the way in which people walk, jump, move, etc. So we observe an entity, we observe its different movement styles, and then we perform some statistical analysis, and then we further use those analyses as a means of authentication. If we talk about wearable authentication devices, they have also been used, or the proof of concept has already been given, and I can give you the example of NIME. This is something that we wear on our wristwatches, and it uses each person's unique ECG signals as a biometric authentication means for authentication into other devices, application, or services. So you take that, you wear that that NIME on your wrist, and then that device takes your ECG, and then that ECG is used as an authentication mechanism to log into other system services or applications. So this is the general flow chart or general diagram that is associated when we employ this means of authentication or biometric authentication, if you want to say it. First step is enrollment. Essentially what you can see from the diagram is tells you about the fingerprint authentication mechanism. The same concepts can be implemented on any type of biometric authentication means. We take a user interface, we use a biometric sensor, this is the sensor, we extract the features of the fingerprint, and then we store them in a biometric database. So this is the enrollment stage. Then we have got the verification. We take the biometric sensor, we take this, we ask the entity to enter his finger or his or her fingerprints. We extract the features, then we match those features, and if the feature matches, it means that we have verified the fingerprints. The next step is the identification. Now in a system, a user tries to log into a system, a service or application. He uses biometric sensor, features are extracted, it goes into the biometric database, and then if it is compares, the user is allowed to access the resources, or if these fingerprints do not match, the user is denied the access of that system. So essentially there are 3 steps or 3 stages involved in the biometric authentication mechanism. One of the reasons why biometric was slow in adoption is the false acceptance rate and the false rejection rate, which we can name as false positives and false negatives. These 2 terms, false positives, false negatives, and true positive and true negatives, we will come across these terminologies in this course. It's very essential to understand the concept of these 4 terminologies. Here we are only discussing about false positives and false negatives. False positive is when a scan falls within the confidence limits, even though subject is not the authentic person. If your system or your confidence limits are very weak, if another entity uses his or her fingerprints and the system recognizes that entity as the legitimate entity, then it's a false positive. What is false rejection or false negative? You do not allow an authentic entity to access the system resource. If you have entered your fingerprint and the system's confidence limits are very strong, then a legitimate person will not be allowed to access the resources. He will not be authenticated. Other than this concept, there are some other resistance to the adoption of biometrics, because there are people who raises privacy concerns. They say that why they want to take our ECG, why they want to take our face recognition, why they want to take our gait analysis, and why they want to perform other iris scans or fingerprints or hand recognition. So people have started raising this concern. So that is one of the other reason that stops or delays the adoption of biometrics. As biometrics becomes more widely used, these concerns become more widespread, because people are asking these questions. What will happen to all that information that the system is obtaining from us? What database will it end up to? How large this database will be? How will you ensure the security of that database? What if the database gets compromised? All of our personal information will be open to attack entities, and then that information will be sold in the black market. So these kind of questions are asked by different people that restricts the adoption of biometrics. The other factors that inhibits the biometric adoption is social, cultural, religious values, technical, economical. I've listed many possibilities that inhibits the biometric adoption. They need not to be true. All of them need not to be true for not adopting biometrics. One of the factor may restrict a person not to use the biometric authentication. If someone is not socially comfortable or religiously comfortable in giving facial recognition or iris scans or hand geometry, then the system will have to have a mechanism that allows an entity to access the resources without biometric authentication in place. So you need to reach an agreement where all the persons are able to understand that why biometric authentication is important, and each one of the persons should be able to give his or her biometrics once that trust is generated, once that confidence is built up. So it is the lack of confidence mainly that restricts the adoption of biometrics. While people are still discussing on how to improve these factors, the researchers and other research organizations have started to think how biometrics can be used in the future. Biometrics can be used starting a car. We have used the concept of halo ring. We have seen the concept of halo ring, which is used by Bankwest, that can be extended into biometrics, and that can be used to start a car, to open the main door of your home, that can be used to access medical records, withdraw money from bank accounts. People have seen proof of concepts in biometric firearm authentication that ensure that only the rightful owner can access and use the weapon. So if that person, if that firearm does not belong to a person, and if that person attempts to use that firearm, that person will not be allowed to use that, because it first checks the biometrics, and if the biometrics matches, only then the firearm is going to work, otherwise it will not operate. NYU Langone Medical Center in the United States is using biometrics for quite some years to authenticate users, patients, to unlock their records. The main idea behind this concept is if a person who is unconscious, who is unable to give proof his authentication mechanism, and if he has met some accident, if he is unconscious, as soon as that patient reaches into the hospital, and the doctor needs to have patient's medical records in order to give some medication or start looking into the issues that patient is going through. So if the person is unconscious, that biometric concept can be used to unlock that entity's records. That essentially helps the doctors to handle that patient in a more professional way. But there's a flip side to it. If your medical records are so easily can so easily be taken, if you're unconscious, that can be used by the attacker entities to get your critical information. So every concept has got pros and cons, and we need to evaluate those pros and cons before we implement those concepts in computer security or cyber security. We have discussed this word, but we have not. We have just discussed this concept only to the level of definition. I want to have some more discussion on multi-factor authentication, because it's a very important concept, and it is being widely implemented nowadays, and it is one of the essential 8 principles that is the Australian government is asking organizations to implement. So we know multi-factor authentication is when more than one identity check is conducted by different channels. We know this definition, and we have discussed the example of ATM cards. So we take our ATM card, we use our PIN, those two joins together and allows us to take out the money from the bank. So that is an example of two-factor authentication. Another example, you enter your password and an extra authentication code is then sent to you on your phone via SMS message, email or voicemail. So that is another example of multi-factor authentication. Another example I can give you is when you do your online banking, when you have to pay an amount to a person or entity for the first time using online banking, what happens actually? We log into our online banking system, we enter the bank details of that person or that entity to whom we want to pay something. Once we click the submit button, we receive a code on our mobile phones or on our email. We use that code and enter that code on that online banking web page, and once that web page is once that code is entered, we are then allowed to proceed to next step and successfully transfer the money to that person or that entity. So that one code that we receive is known as one-time password or one-time PIN code. So you know about three-factor authentication. Though the idea is still not mature, people have started talking about four-factor authentication and five-factor authentication. It is still not a well-defined concept, but sensitive organizations have started to implement this four-factor authentication concept. And what could be the fourth factor or the fifth factor? Sometimes time factor is considered as the fourth factor for authentication. Your GPS device, because we all carry our mobile phones and they are all equipped with GPS devices, they are sometimes called fourth or fifth factor for authentication. Your MAC addresses, media access control addresses, which are unique to a particular computer, they can never be repeated. So sometimes this MAC address can be taken as fourth or fifth form of authentication. An example for the time factor I can give you is if a person uses an ATM card in Perth, will not be able to use the same service in Sydney after 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 30 minutes. So as soon as the bank sees that there's a person who has used the ATM services in Perth and after some time, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, the same mechanism has been used to take out the money from Sydney, they will come to know that there's a problem with this bank account and this ATM card. Something has been compromised. Okay? One of the other example I can give that actually happens to me. I used my, in some previous years, I used my ATM card in a different city, and whereas I used to live in one of the city, I went to some other city for a visit, and when I performed an online transaction on that in that city, I was doing some shopping. I immediately received a call from the bank that someone has used your card for this much amount and in this city. So do you confirm this transaction? And I said, yes, I can confirm this transaction. So that is the example of GPS or time or location, because bank was monitoring my all transaction history, and it was showing to them that all of my bank history pertains to only one city. And as soon as I have that a transaction on my account was undertaken in a different city, they immediately called me and asked me. So these all concepts fall under the definition of multi-factor authentication. There are few readings. I have listed 3 of them, which I want you to read. One is an article which has recently been published in The Conversation about multi-factor authentication. Second one is implementing multi-factor authentication. It is a document from the ACSC, as Australian Cyber Security. And the third document is NIST special publication on digital identity guidelines. I don't expect you to read this. It's a long document, but it's nice to have as a reference whenever you want to do some assignment or you want to refer it. You can always find something relevant under this concept of authentication. or identification. That's it. This brings us to the end of today's lecture, and I'll see you in the tutorials. Thank you.